Overthinking is not a thinking problem. It's a responsibility problem. The mind spins when it refuses to decide. Stoics didn't calm their thoughts by distraction. They ended the inner noise by choosing authority over themselves. Before we go any further, something needs to be said clearly. What we just uncovered wasn't meant to make you feel bad. It was meant to wake you up. Because once you recognize that avoidance is happening, you reach a crossroads. You either return to the comfort of thinking, or you step into the discomfort of action. And this is where most people quietly turn back. Here's why. There is a subtle trick the mind plays when power is nearby. It doesn't scream fear. It whispers virtue. A strange tension shows up right before meaningful action. Not panic, not doubt, but a calm, reasonable voice that says, "Let me think this through a little more." That voice feels responsible, mature, ethical, and that's exactly why it's so dangerous. Overthinking often disguises itself as moral high ground. It wears the mask of care. I don't want to hurt anyone. I need to be fair. I want to make the best decision. On the surface, these sound noble. But look closer. How many times has that concern led to movement? How many times has it actually led to change? Most of the time, it leads to delay. The mind learns that if it frames hesitation as thoughtfulness, it avoids criticism. From others, yes, but more importantly, from yourself. You don't have to admit fear if you call it caution. You don't have to admit indecision if you call it complexity. This is moral camouflage. It allows you to feel like a good person while staying exactly where you are. Stoicism cuts straight through this illusion. It never confused virtue with comfort. For the Stoics, virtue wasn't about having perfect reasoning or flawless intentions. Virtue was action aligned with values, even when certainty was missing, especially when certainty was missing, because life never offers full clarity. Waiting to feel completely sure is not wisdom. It's avoidance with a polished explanation. The world doesn't reward those who think forever. It responds to those who act with integrity under pressure. And pressure is exactly what overthinking tries to remove. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Many people don't overthink because they care too much. They overthink because caring feels safer than committing. Caring keeps all options open. Action closes doors. When you decide, you exclude other paths. You disappoint someone. You risk being wrong. You risk being judged. Overthinking keeps everything theoretical, and theory can't fail. Only action can. This is why endless analysis feels clean, untouched, pure, no consequences yet, no fingerprints. But purity without movement is not virtue. It's paralysis dressed in good intentions. The Stoics believed honesty with oneself was the highest discipline. And dishonesty wasn't lying out loud. It was pretending not to see what you already know. Indecision, when clarity is present, becomes a quiet form of self-betrayal. You know when enough thinking has been done. There's a moment when the answer stops changing. After that, every new thought is just a loop, a delay tactic, a way to avoid the weight of responsibility. Responsibility is heavy because it removes the option to blame circumstances. Once you act, you own the result. If it goes well, you can't pretend it was luck. If it goes badly, you can't hide behind, "I wasn't ready." Overthinking protects you from that exposure. But protection has a cost. The longer you delay action, the more your mind learns that thinking equals safety. Over time, this becomes a habit. You start solving life in your head instead of in reality. You plan conversations you never have. You rehearse boundaries you never set. You analyze opportunities you never take. And slowly, you confuse mental activity with progress. This is where many people lose trust in themselves. Not because they failed, but because they never showed up. The mind remembers every promise broken through inaction. Each delay sends a signal. I can't be trusted when things matter. Stoicism offers a different standard. It asks a simple but ruthless question. What is mine to do right now? Not tomorrow, not after more research, now. Action doesn't require certainty, it requires alignment. When your values are clear, the next step is rarely complicated, it's just uncomfortable. And discomfort is not a moral failure. Avoiding it is. Ethical living is not about perfect decisions, it's about honest ones. Acting with the information you have, guided by principles, knowing you may adjust later. The Stoics respected adaptability, but they despised stagnation. Overthinking promises safety, but delivers stagnation. Power demands movement, even small movement, especially small movement, because once action begins, clarity follows, not the other way around. This is why decisive people appear confident, not because they know more, but because they stopped lying to themselves about what needed to be done. Confidence is often the result of action taken, not the cause of it. If this feels uncomfortable, that's a good sign. It means something real is being touched. Moral camouflage only works when it stays invisible. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
The question becomes simple, though not easy. Are you thinking because the situation is unclear, or because acting would require you to step into responsibility?
There is nothing wrong with thinking. The Stoics valued reason deeply, but reason was meant to serve action, not replace it. When thought becomes a shelter instead of a tool, it stops being wisdom. Every time you choose action aligned with your values, even imperfect action, you rebuild self-respect. You teach your mind that courage is possible, that you don't need to hide behind endless analysis to be a good person. Because being ethical is not about appearing careful, it's about being honest. And honesty eventually demands movement. And once movement begins, power stops being something you avoid and starts becoming something you carry. Once you drop the mask of moral camouflage, something else shows up right away. A deeper excuse, a heavier one. Because when you can no longer say, I'm just being careful, the mind reaches for a new shelter. I can't. This is where the trap becomes personal. A quiet sadness hits when you realize how often you've been waiting for permission that will never come. Not from a boss, not from a partner, not from life. You've been waiting for a feeling inside your chest that says, now it's safe to take control. And if that feeling doesn't arrive, you stay frozen. Not because you lack ability, but because helplessness has started to feel like home. That sounds harsh. But it's also freeing, because you can't fix what you refuse to name. Helplessness can become emotionally comfortable because it reduces pressure. When you tell yourself, I'm overwhelmed, you don't have to act. When you tell yourself, I'm confused, you don't have to choose. When you tell yourself, I'm trapped, you don't have to risk change. In a strange way, powerlessness can feel like rest, and the mind loves rest. Not the healthy kind of rest that restores you, but the kind that keeps you small. The kind that prevents you from entering the arena where failure is possible and growth is demanded. This is why some people hold on to their problems like they're holding on to a pillow at night. It's uncomfortable, but familiar. And familiar feels safer than unknown. The most dangerous part is that helplessness can make you feel innocent. If you can't do anything, then nothing is your fault. You don't have to face the painful question, what if the reason my life hasn't changed is because I kept choosing not to move? So the mind starts building a story where the world is too strong and you are too weak. That story becomes a shield, and you start defending it. You defend it by listing obstacles. You defend it by pointing to past failures. You defend it by saying the timing isn't right. You defend it by over-explaining your situation to anyone who will listen. Not because you want solutions, but because repeating the story makes it feel real, solid, final. And then one day you realize you've become loyal to your own limitation. That's the comfort addiction. It's not that you like suffering. It's that suffering comes with a hidden reward, relief from responsibility. It gives you a reason to pause, a reason to delay, a reason to stay in the same place without calling it fear. This is why I'm just thinking it through can be a cover for I don't want to carry the weight of choosing. Thinking feels active, but it keeps you protected. It's motion without exposure. Stoicism breaks this addiction in a simple way. It refuses to accept total helplessness as a permanent state. The Stoics never promised you control over outcomes. They promised something more useful, control over your response. That might sound like a small thing, but it's the beginning of everything. Because if you can control your next response, you are not powerless. If you can control your next step, you are not trapped. If you can control your attention, you are not defeated. Most people lose power not because they lack strength, but because they keep searching for a big, dramatic moment where they suddenly feel powerful. They want a surge of confidence, a perfect plan, a clean path, and a guarantee. Stoicism says you won't get that. You get something smaller, one choice. And one choice is enough. Agency is not a feeling. It is a decision. It's the decision to take ownership of one action, even if your emotions are loud and your situation is messy. Here's how you locate the smallest unit of control. Stop asking, how do I fix my whole life? That question is too large, so the mind panics and escapes. Start asking, what is the next controllable action? Not the best action, not the final action. The next one. Sometimes the next controllable action is physical. Stand up, drink water, take a shower, clean one surface, send one email, write one paragraph, put on your shoes. The body is often the first lever of power because it's the most direct. Sometimes the next controllable action is social. Speak one honest sentence, cancel one commitment you resent, ask one hard question, say no once, say yes once. You don't need a speech. You need a line you can stand behind. Sometimes the next controllable action is mental. Stop feeding the spiral. Notice the thought, label it, and bring your attention back to what you can do. The Stoics treated attention like a weapon. What you aim at grows, what you starve weakens. This is not about pretending everything is fine. Stoicism is not denial, it is precision. It is refusing to waste energy on what you cannot command while fully committing to what you can. And here's what happens when you take that smallest action. You interrupt the helplessness loop. Helplessness is a loop because it uses the past as proof. I tried before. It didn't work. I always end up here. But the past is not a prison unless you keep using it as a judge. The moment you act differently, even slightly, you create new evidence.
That new evidence is powerful. It tells your nervous system movement is possible. It tells your identity. I am the kind of person who takes action. It tells your future. I'm no longer waiting.
This is how authority is built, not through a single heroic decision, but through repeated proof that you can respond. Most people think power is something you have. In reality, power is something you practice. It's a habit of choosing. And yes, at first, it will feel uncomfortable, because the comfort addiction will fight back. The mind will say, "This won't matter." It will say, "You're too late." It will say, "It's not enough." That voice is not truth. That voice is withdrawal. It's the old identity begging you to return. Do not argue with it. Do not debate it for hours. Just act anyway. Stoicism teaches that you don't need your emotions to agree before you move. You don't need the inner storm to stop. You need to steer through it. A helpful Stoic question is, if I were already the person I want to be, what would I do next? Not what would I feel, what would I do? Because feelings are weather. Action is direction. Another question is, what would I do if I respected myself? This cuts through self-pity fast, because self-respect doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like discipline. Sometimes it feels like discomfort, but it always feels clean afterward. The comfort addiction of helplessness dies when you stop waiting for life to become easier and start becoming someone who can handle difficulty. That's not motivational talk. That's training. And when you train this daily, something surprising happens. Your world starts to respond. People treat you differently. Opportunities show up because you're moving. Your mind quiets down because it no longer has to create excuses to protect you. It can finally serve you.
Not by spinning stories, but by guiding action. You don't need to reclaim all your power today. You only need to reclaim the next inch of it.
That inch becomes a foot. That foot becomes a path. And one day you look back and realize you are no longer living like someone who is trapped. You are living like someone who decides. As soon as helplessness loses its grip, another layer of resistance reveals itself. This one is quieter, smarter, and harder to catch, because now you're no longer saying, "I can't." You're saying, "I need to think about how this will affect people." This is where overthinking becomes social. There's a tight feeling that shows up when action would change how others see you. Not fear of failing, fear of shifting the balance, fear of what happens after you step forward and the room goes silent for half a second longer than usual. That silence matters. Most people don't avoid action because they're afraid of being wrong. They avoid it because they're afraid of being seen differently. Because power doesn't just change outcomes, it changes relationships. The moment you assert a boundary, someone loses access. The moment you choose ambition, someone feels smaller. The moment you decide firmly, someone else loses influence. And the mind knows this. So it starts intellectualizing. It analyzes tone, timing, delivery. It replays conversations that haven't happened yet. It tries to predict reactions, expressions, shifts in energy. Not to improve clarity, but to delay impact. Because once you act, people must respond. And response means repositioning. Human groups always have invisible hierarchies. Who leads, who follows, who adapts, who waits. These roles aren't officially assigned, but everyone feels them. When you stay undecided, you stay predictable. When you stay agreeable, you stay safe. Power disrupts predictability. That's why people who finally act often hear things like, "You've changed." Not because they became worse, but because they stopped orbiting other people's expectations. Change feels threatening to those who benefited from the old version of you. So the mind steps in with a clever defense, intellectualization. You start saying things like, "I just want to consider all perspectives," or "I don't want to create tension," or "This is complicated." These statements sound mature, balanced, reasonable, but often they're shields.
They delay the moment where someone might be disappointed, challenged, or forced to adjust.
This is especially common in people who learned early that harmony equals safety. If you were rewarded for being easy to deal with, thoughtful, agreeable, you may have learned that causing discomfort equals danger. So you keep thinking, refining, softening, explaining, until nothing happens. Stoicism teaches indifference to reputation, but not because reputation is meaningless. It's because reputation is unstable. You cannot control it without surrendering yourself. And the cost of that surrender is self-respect. Self-respect doesn't come from being liked. It comes from being aligned. Here's the truth most people avoid. The fear is not that action will go wrong. The fear is that action will work, that it will move you into a different position, and others will have to decide how to relate to you now. Some will step back, some will test you, some will quietly resent you, some will respect you more but say less.
And yes, some connections may weaken.
Overthinking keeps you from facing this. It keeps relationships frozen in a familiar shape. You stay the listener, the helper, the flexible one, the one who gets it. That role has benefits. It also has limits. Power changes the script. This is why asserting a boundary can feel harder than failing at a task. Failure is impersonal. Boundaries are relational. They force a mirror onto the other person. They reveal who respects you and who only respected your silence. Intellectualization delays that reveal. You keep thinking not because you're unclear, but because clarity would force a social consequence you're not ready to carry. Here's where Stoicism goes deeper than most advice. It doesn't tell you to stop caring about others. It tells you to stop letting other people's reactions decide your character. Your job is not to manage how everyone feels. Your job is to act according to your values. Other people's discomfort is not a signal that you're wrong. Sometimes it's a signal that the balance has shifted, and balance must shift if growth is real. Think about how often you've rehearsed conversations instead of having them. How often you've softened your truth until it barely exists. How often you've delayed a decision so long that the opportunity chose for you. That wasn't kindness. That was avoidance.
Avoidance keeps peace on the surface while eroding respect underneath. And not just others' respect, your own.
Because each time you swallow an action to maintain comfort, a small message is sent inward. My needs come second. Over time, that message becomes identity. Then one day you wonder why people don't take you seriously, why your words don't carry weight, why your presence feels optional. The answer isn't confidence, it's history. A history of delayed action. Stoicism reframes this clearly. You are responsible for your choices, not for how they are received. You can be respectful without being passive. You can be firm without being cruel, but you cannot be powerful without being willing to be misunderstood. That's the price. Social consequences are unavoidable when you stop hiding. Someone will feel uncomfortable. Someone will push back. Someone will test whether you really mean it this time. That doesn't mean you did something wrong. It means the old rules no longer apply. Here's a critical distinction. Overthinking tries to avoid discomfort now, but guarantees resentment later. Action accepts discomfort now to prevent long-term self-betrayal. One feels safer in the moment. The other builds a life you can stand inside. A Stoic practice that helps here is separating intention from reaction. Before acting, ask yourself, is this aligned with who I choose to be? Not, will everyone approve? Approval is external. Alignment is internal. Another useful question. If no one reacted at all, would I still do this? If the answer is yes, you already know what needs to happen. Everything else is noise. Power does not announce itself. It arrives quietly the moment you stop negotiating with your fear of social friction. And something surprising happens when you finally act. Most people don't explode. The world doesn't collapse. Some adjust, some leave, some stay. Some respect you more than they ever did when you were endlessly accommodating. But even if none of that happened, one thing would still matter most. You showed up as yourself. That alone changes how you walk into rooms, how you speak, how you decide. Your nervous system learns that discomfort didn't kill you, that honesty didn't destroy you, that power is survivable. And once that lesson lands, overthinking loses one of its strongest weapons. You stop delaying action to manage reactions. You stop hiding clarity behind complexity. You stop shrinking to protect comfort. Not because you stopped caring about people, but because you finally started caring about yourself. And that shift rearranges everything. After facing the social cost of action, the mind finds one last place to hide. It steps back, folds its arms, and says, "I'm just waiting until I'm sure." This sounds reasonable, responsible even, but this is where the final illusion lives. There's a quiet tension when you realize how long you've been waiting for certainty that was never promised to you. People often believe hesitation means they're being careful thinkers. In reality, hesitation often means they're confusing two very different things: clarity and certainty. And that confusion keeps lives on pause. Here's the emotional hook most don't expect. Certainty feels safe because it removes risk, but clarity feels dangerous because it demands movement. Stoicism never asked for certainty. It asked for alignment. Certainty is about outcomes. Clarity is about values. One depends on the future. The other exists right now. Modern thinking teaches that the more you analyze, the better your decision will be. That if you just collect enough data, read enough opinions, or think long enough, doubt will disappear. But doubt doesn't disappear with information. It disappears with commitment. And commitment doesn't wait for certainty. The Stoics understood something deeply unsettling. Life does not reward those who wait to feel ready. It responds to those who act according to what they believe is right, even while uncertainty remains. This is where many people get stuck. They say they're still thinking, but what they're really doing is hoping clarity will magically turn into certainty. They want the discomfort removed before they move. Stoicism says the opposite. Movement often creates clarity. Once your values are clear, hesitation stops being intellectual. It becomes ethical. That's a hard sentence to swallow, because it means the delay is no longer about not knowing, it's about not doing. And that threatens the self-image of being thoughtful, careful, and principled. Values are simple. They are not easy, but they are simple. Honesty, courage, responsibility, respect, discipline. These don't require endless analysis. They require decision. When you know what matters, the next step is usually obvious. What's not obvious is whether you're willing to accept the discomfort that comes with acting on it. That's why people stay stuck in thought. Thinking feels productive without forcing a test of character. Action tests who you really are. Stoicism reframes this sharply. Once values are clear, hesitation is no longer a sign of intelligence. It's a sign of avoidance. Not because the situation is unclear, but because the cost of alignment feels too high.
This doesn't mean acting recklessly. It means acting honestly.
There is a difference. Recklessness ignores values. Stoic action is guided by them. But it doesn't wait for guarantees. It doesn't wait for everyone to agree. It doesn't wait for fear to disappear. Fear is expected. Uncertainty is expected. What is not acceptable in Stoic thinking is self-deception. If you say you value integrity but avoid a hard conversation, the problem isn't lack of certainty, it's lack of courage. If you say you value growth but avoid taking the next step, the issue isn't confusion, it's resistance. This is destabilizing because it removes the comfort of blaming complexity. It puts responsibility back where it belongs. Most people don't want certainty. They want permission. Permission to act without consequence. Permission to be right without risk. Permission to move without being exposed. But no one gives that permission.
The Stoics believed that character is revealed in moments of uncertainty, not when the path is clear, but when it's foggy and you still step forward.
That's why clarity of values matters more than certainty of outcome. Outcomes are outside your control. Values are not. You can't control how people respond. You can't control how events unfold. You can control whether you act in alignment. This is where hesitation becomes costly. Each delay chips away at self-trust. You start questioning yourself not because you failed, but because you didn't act when you knew you should have. And the mind remembers. Over time, this creates a pattern. You stop trusting your own clarity. You begin outsourcing decisions to feelings, timing, or other people. You wait for motivation instead of honoring principles. Life becomes reactive instead of directed. Stoicism refuses that path. It says, decide who you are, then act accordingly. Let the outcome fall where it may. This doesn't make life easier. It makes it cleaner.
There is less inner noise when your actions match your values, less mental looping, less regret, less need to justify delay. You may still feel fear, but it no longer controls the steering wheel.
A powerful Stoic question is not, what's the safest choice, but what does my character demand here? That question cuts through overthinking fast. Another is, if this situation repeats 100 times, who do I want to be each time? That removes the obsession with one outcome and replaces it with identity. Because Stoicism is not about winning moments. It's about building a life you can respect. Modern culture praises intelligence, but Stoicism prioritizes integrity. Intelligence without action becomes vanity. Integrity without certainty becomes strength. And here's the shift that changes everything. Once values are clear, delay becomes a choice, not a necessity. You may still choose to wait, but now you know what you're doing. You're choosing comfort over alignment, safety over self-respect. And once that's conscious, the excuse dissolves. This awareness can feel heavy at first, because it removes the illusion that you're stuck, but it also restores power. Because if you're choosing delay, you can also choose movement. Stoicism doesn't judge you for hesitating. It simply refuses to lie to you about why.
Clarity is enough. Values are enough. The next step doesn't require certainty. It requires honesty.
And once you stop confusing thinking with wisdom, something shifts inside. Decisions feel simpler, not because life got easier, but because you stopped demanding guarantees before honoring who you are. You begin acting not when fear is gone, but when integrity calls, and that's where real strength lives. Once clarity replaces certainty, there is nowhere left for the mind to hide, except in identity. This is the final refuge, the most protected one. Because now the resistance is no longer about thinking, fear, or uncertainty. It's about who you believe you are. And losing that can feel like losing everything. There's a subtle grief that shows up when action threatens the story you've been telling about yourself for years. Not loudly, quietly, almost respectfully. A feeling that says, if I do this, I won't be me anymore. That feeling stops more lives than fear ever could. Many people don't avoid power because they don't want it. They avoid it because power would collapse the identity they've built to survive. The identity that explains why things haven't worked out yet. The identity that protects their sense of worth without forcing change. Overthinking becomes the guardian of that identity.
As long as you stay in thought, the story stays intact.
You can remain the thoughtful one, the deep thinker, the person with so much potential, the one who would have succeeded if circumstances were different, the one who was misunderstood, the one who just needed more time. Action ruins these stories,
Because once you act, the story must face reality. Potential becomes performance. Intention becomes behavior. Excuses lose their power. And that's terrifying. Not because failure might happen, but because clarity will.
Stoicism threatens identity in a way few philosophies do. It doesn't ask who you think you are. It asks what you do, repeatedly, consistently, under pressure. And whatever you do becomes who you are. This is why people cling to overthinking. Thought preserves identity without requiring proof. You can believe anything about yourself as long as it's never tested. But action tests everything. If you act decisively, you can no longer be the victim of circumstance. You may still face hardship, but you can't claim helplessness in the same way. If you take responsibility, the old narrative collapses. If you set boundaries, you're no longer the endlessly understanding one. If you choose ambition, you're no longer the humble observer. If you act with courage, you're no longer the person waiting for the right moment. Power changes the mirror, and many people are not ready to look into it. Identity is comforting because it explains pain without demanding change. It gives meaning to suffering. This is just how my life is. This is who I am. There's a strange safety in that finality. Stoicism doesn't attack identity directly. It dissolves it by demanding alignment. If you say you value strength but act in avoidance, the tension becomes unbearable. One must go. Either the belief changes or the behavior does. Most people change the belief. They lower the standard. They redefine what strength means. They say things like, "I'm just not that kind of person." This keeps the identity safe, but it also keeps the cage locked. Overthinking helps here. It creates endless internal dialogue that postpones the moment of reckoning. You stay in analysis because analysis doesn't threaten identity. It reinforces it. See how complex I am. See how much I care. See how deeply I think. But the Stoics were ruthless about this. They believed identity was not something to protect, but something to earn. You are what you practice. That idea is destabilizing because it means there is no hidden self waiting to be discovered, no true version buried under circumstances. There is only the pattern of your actions. And if that's true, then avoiding action is not neutral. It actively shapes who you become. This is why people stay attached to being almost ready, almost confident, almost healed, almost successful. Almost allows identity to stay aspirational without becoming accountable. Action ends almost. Once you act, the illusion dissolves. You see clearly what works, what doesn't, where you're strong, where you're weak. There is no romance in it, just reality. And reality is freeing, but only after it's humbling. Stoicism teaches that freedom comes not from protecting the ego, but from shedding it. The ego wants consistency in the story. Stoicism wants consistency in behavior. When inner belief and outer action align, identity becomes lighter, less defended, less fragile. You no longer need to explain yourself constantly because your life speaks. This is why decisive people often appear calm. They're not carrying a heavy narrative. They're responding to reality as it is, not as it fits a story. Overthinking keeps the story alive. Action replaces story with experience. And yes, there is loss in that. Real loss. You may lose the identity of the misunderstood genius. You may lose the identity of the patient martyr. You may lose the identity of the good person who never rocked the boat. But what you gain is something far more valuable: self-respect grounded in reality. Stoicism does not promise admiration. It promises integrity. And integrity requires letting go of who you thought you were supposed to be. This is why growth feels like grief. You're not just changing behavior, you're letting parts of your identity die. Parts that kept you safe. Parts that once served you. But they have an expiration date. Holding on to them past that date becomes self-sabotage disguised as loyalty. Here's the hardest truth. If you never act, you never have to update your self-image. But you also never get free. Freedom requires exposure. Exposure requires action. Action requires letting go of the story. A Stoic practice that helps here is asking, who do I become if I keep doing this for 5 more years? Not who you say you are, but who you're becoming through repetition. Another is, if no one knew my intentions, who would I appear to be? That question strips identity down to behavior fast. Stoicism doesn't ask you to hate your past self, it asks you not to worship it. Because identity should be fluid, not sacred. It should respond to truth, not resist it. When you stop protecting identity, something unexpected happens. You feel lighter, less defensive, less invested in explaining yourself. You no longer need to be seen as anything in particular. You just need to act in alignment. And that alignment creates a new identity, not one you cling to, but one that emerges naturally. One built on action, not aspiration. On courage, not stories. On responsibility, not excuses. Overthinking preserves identity. Action dissolves illusion. And the loss of illusion is not a tragedy. It's the price of real freedom. Because when the story falls away, what remains is something stronger than identity. It's character.
And character doesn't need protection.
You've seen it now. Overthinking was never the problem. It was the disguise. A way to look ethical while avoiding action. A way to feel safe while surrendering control. A way to protect reputation, preserve identity, and wait for certainty that never comes. Stoicism didn't offer comfort. It offered responsibility, clarity over certainty, Action over excuses, character over stories. Power was never taken from you. It was postponed. And the moment you stop postponing, everything changes. If this hit you, don't explain it. Own it. Write, "I choose action" in the comments. That's your line in the sand.
And if you're done consuming ideas and ready to live them, subscribe now. Not for motivation, for discipline, for truth, for power.
Because thinking ends here.